Okay, good evening, Erev Tov. I always like to dedicate Shiurim in memory of or in recognition of. And there is a young man that was killed in the current war that I never knew, but my wife's cousin's nephew, so I want to mention his name, Shaul Gringley, Zichrono Livracha. He was a very talented guy, singer. He was actually on, I think, one of the singing shows that they have here, the equivalent of The Voice or whatever it is. He was killed in Gaza, and I didn't know him, but I'm told he was a very special guy, and Tei Zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. Wow. I said to my wife this evening, I'm a little bit concerned because you come here for a little bit of light relief, and we're going to talk about war this evening, so I do apologize. We've never really been able to get away from it. The story that we're going to learn this in, the character, till now it's been mainly introductions, giving you an overview of the time period and what was going on and the ups and downs and the graph that I showed you at the beginning, and then last week we talked about the intermarriage, which was such an issue already. This week we're going to get into a character who I generally find, although we all heard of him, Ehud ben Gerah, everybody's heard of Ehud. The reality of it is that he doesn't get a lot of press. To put it very bluntly, he's the sort of guy that, when you're teaching Shoftim in school, I have to ask my son because he's got all his notes on my book, you spend about one lesson on Ehud and you spend 10 lessons on Devorah. And he deserves a little bit more attention. He is a remarkable, remarkable individual. What we'll do is two things tonight. We're going to go through the story of Ehud, which is chapter 3, Perek Gimel, the middle of Perek Gimel. So we're up to verse 12, if I'm not mistaken, Pasuk Yud Bet. We'll go through these psukim, making some interesting observations, I hope, about the story. And then I just want to share with you a text from a gentleman. The book is available in Hebrew, not in English, unfortunately. It's called Parshiyot B'Sifrei Nevi'im. It's a book which came out after the gentleman passed away, a man by the name of Yitzhak Levi. Yitzhak Levi was a teacher in Chorev in Yerushalayim. Turns out my wife's got a lot of cousins here. So another cousin, he was actually in his class in school, told me about it. He wasn't too excited about him as a teacher, but turns out that as a writer, he's written he's not alive anymore. He wrote the most wonderful, comprehensive commentary from the beginning of Yoshua, and he unfortunately died in the middle of Sefer Shmuel. In other words, he couldn't finish it. And they asked his sons to finish it. His sons are both, two sons, they're both in the yeshiva world, and they said, no, we can't in any way do justice to what our father did, and they left it. So you've got this very frustrating, for a teacher, it's very frustrating. You're learning Sefer Shmuel, you get to Perek Tedvav, and then he's gone. He's not around anymore. There's nothing in print. So at least on Sefer Shoftim, I want to share with you a little bit of what he said, because what he says here is too gorgeous to miss out. So please bear with me. We're going to do a little bit of psukim, get the story clear, and this is again famous story. I mentioned last time about Ehud being kind of a popular name for leadership in Israel. Not the greatest Ehuds that I've ever come across. I've got to be honest about it, going on record to say so. But I'm really disturbed by one Ehud at the moment who has a campaign against the state of Israel, and I'm really, really, really disturbing. But that's what it is. I hope that maybe he'll see the light. Please God, one day. All right, so we are looking at chapter 3, and we're going to start getting into psukim in a more serious way, I hope. And we're looking at verse 11. I'm going to start from verse 11. After Othniel, the guy we mentioned 2 weeks ago, who was the brother-in-law of, in fact, he was the stepbrother of Kalev, Kalev was the brother-in-law of Moshe. He had all the milas, all the connections. And he was a very, very, very intense religious personality, meaning a man who brought back the lessons of Torah, which were forgotten during the time that Moshe had died. Othniel was a great scholar. He was also a very great man of prayer, we're told, and a lot of sort of very, the sort of character that would have fitted in very nicely had he appeared in Sefer Devarim and not in Sefer Shoftim, and also he's actually in Sefer Yeshua. He would have been at home in the 5 books of Torah. When we leave Othniel behind, we're told the land was quiet for 40 years. I want to make this one point. I mentioned that the period of Judges, approximately 370 years, and ups and downs, and we get the impression that the country was never really quiet. It's not true. The reality is, we're going to read here, after Othniel died, 40 years, nothing going on, right? Back to your tomatoes, back to your cucumbers, back to, sort of doing Tanuva is in business again, and that's it, 40 years. And after Ehud, it's 80 years. So that's 120 years. It's a long time when the country really is, we're told, b'sheket. It's quiet. There's nobody cheppering, nobody coming from the outside, nobody on the, everybody seems to be living in peace. So the period of Judges does have periods of quiet, which are referred to literally in half a pasuk, but that covers an enormous period of time. When it says the land was quiet for 80 years, that's a long period of time. 80 years is 2 or 3 generations. And I just want to point that out, that although the stories seem to be up and down, the amount of time that the country was in turmoil was relatively small. Not insignificant, but certainly not as up and down as one gets the impression initially reading this stuff. So I wanted to make that point, and we'll mention it again. Even after Shimshon, I think it says 20 years after Shimshon, it was quiet. Right, so this is there's stuff going on here which is really positive. But let's see the story of Ehud, and we'll go through this quite quickly. Pasuk Yudal, chapter 3, verse 11. And if you haven't got the book, if you have your smartphone, Sefaria, I'm plugging Sefaria because it's really something special. They just sent me a request for donation yet again, but I don't mind. I send them money because it's worth it. As we said, it was 40 years of peace. Othniel ben Kenaz. Othniel's gone. That's it. Now, all of a sudden, too quiet. We're bored. We've got nothing to do. So the families, as we said last time, remember the intermarriage. All of a sudden, they learn the ways of the goyim, of the people living here, the nations, and things go bad. The Jews start indulging in idolatry. God provided the enemy, a guy called Eglon. Eglon, such a wonderful name. Eglon means agol, round. And according to tradition, this man was very around. Okay, to put it very bluntly, he was a rather large gentleman, rather rotund. And it says, Alki Asuat Rabbi Hashem. So Hashem even provided the counterpoint, the nemesis, right? He's there, Eglon. And what did he do? Yud Gimel. He made a pact with friends. This today we're used to this, but the Arab world sort of teams up to come against us. And he smites the Jews, and particularly the city of palms, which we know is Jericho. He goes to Jericho and he conquers it. Jericho, unfortunately, many of you, I guess, have never been there. I was lucky. I was there in 1976. 2 things I remember about it. Number one, it was very hot, like incredibly hot. And the walls that came tumbling down. They do claim they have the remnants of the walls. But the guide said he's not quite sure. He thinks somebody put them, has put them there as a tourist thing. But we can't get to Jericho anymore, which one day hopefully it'll come back to us. Yudala. So the Jews are in trouble. They have to serve this guy Eglon. For 18 years. It's a long time. All right. And this guy Eglon is really not a nice person. Let's put it in its context. Just to inform you, in case you weren't aware, Eglon is, according to tradition, the father or grandfather of Ruth. How shocking is that? Right? So although we don't like this guy, he is one of the people in the Messianic line. How scary is that? You got this guy Eglon, whose granddaughter, or maybe daughter even, is Ruth, whose great-grandson is David HaMelech, right? And whose great-great, whatever great it is Mashiach ben David. And here's Eglon, and he's part of the Messianic process. Absolutely mind-blowing. And you'll see something about Eglon in a minute, which is even more mind-blowing. We can't rule these people out. We always seem to have a place, even for these bad guys. We try and find a place in Jewish tradition. I'll talk about that in a minute. Tedva. The Jews cried, this is happening. So a savior comes from God. Et Ehud ben Gerah ben Yemini. He's a man of Benjamin. Ehud, the son of Gerah. Ish ite yad yamino, and it stresses that his right arm was not working. It was paralyzed or whatever. He was not functioning, and as a soldier, you wonder how he functioned at all, right? And if he was right-handed, then he's really in trouble, right? And his right arm was useless. What is so amazing about Ehud is the fact that for him the problem became the solution. Very often, I just want to mention this in honor of my mother-in-law, and my wife will kill me when I'm talking about my mother-in-law, but in 1976, my mother-in-law started a school. She's 92 years old now. Liane Hora lives in Shoresh. She's gesund. She's an amazing lady. She started a school in 1976 in London called Kisharon. And Kisharon means ability. And it was a school for literally mentally challenged and physically challenged, all different types of handicaps and challenges, and it was unique, particularly in the frum world, where until then in England the policy was not to even admit that such a child existed, and it was horrible what was going on. And my mother-in-law said she wants to change, and she changed it. And today it's got 6 centres in London: Golders Green and Hendon, Northwest London, 6 different places where the Kisharon. The idea was that every child has his or her ability. And the ability needs to be, literally brought out of the child, and then the child can function and be productive. And unbelievable what happened then and what is still happening today. And to me, this is what Ehud is all about. Ehud is the guy who takes his disability and says, I can use this for the sake, not just for my own personal sake, for the sake of Klal Yisrael. Unbelievable. And I'm stressing that because I think this is really significant. So we're told, Yad Yamino, so his right arm was not working. And they made the following arrangement, that because he probably looked a little bit nebuchal, he didn't look so good. Certainly not he's not a shimshon. He's not a guy coming in with who's been at the gym all the time or whatever. And he's got to bring a tribute to Eglon. Right, one of the things you did in these situations is that you always took something to the foreign king. Okay, as I mentioned, I might have mentioned this. I don't know if I mentioned this here. I think the Queen of England, now the King of England, has more Chanukiot, I think, than anybody else in the Jewish world. I think every time a Jewish group goes to visit, they take him a Chanukiah and menorah. And apparently there's closets full of them over there in Buckingham Palace. Quite amazing. But go figure that. So you take a mincha, you take an offering, some sort of present. Look at this. Pasuk Tetzai. But Yaslo Ehud Cheret. Ehud, in the meantime, had a plan. And he made a sword. And we're going to talk about the sword in a minute. The Losh De Peyot Gomed Orka. Very short sword. More like, I guess, a sort of dagger, maybe an extended dagger. And it was double-edged. And we'll talk about the double edge also in a minute. So he decided, you know what? When I go to the metal detector, they're not going to worry about what I've got on my right side because they'll see my arm is not working, right? So what he did is that he hid the sword under his cloak or his tunic or whatever on his right side. So of course, with his left arm, he could immediately draw the dagger or the sword, plunge it into the king, and goodbye, Eglon. But you'll see how he did this. Brilliant. Instead of it being a handicap for him, it became his way of destroying the enemy king. Unbelievable. And it says, it was on his right thigh. So the sword was hidden, or the dagger, under his cloak. I'm just going to read this through to the end. And he brought this offering Eglon Melech Moab to Eglon. Eglon ish bari ma'od. I love the euphemism here. He was a very healthy. You would say in Yiddish, zaftiger mensch, right? You know what that means. A new translation I could think of. A gesundter, but more than gesund. He really was. He used to like his meat and potatoes, I guess. Yudchet. So Ehud bringing the present, he brought it forward. And at that point, Eglon says, right, everybody out. Go. V'hu shav min hapsilim asher at Gilgal, right? And what happened was that seems to be the location from which Ehud came, from the quarries. Again, it's giving this information, which I'm pretty sure Rashi says. Yeah, Rashi here, Mokum shepostin shamavanim minahar. It's a quarry, right? And for whatever reason, it just mentions where he was coming from. Maybe he was covered in dust. I mean, I don't know. There's maybe some reason for that why it mentions it. And he doesn't look like a threat. He's not a clear and present danger to the king of Moab. And Ehud said, Devar seite li elecha hamelech. I've got a secret to tell you. And Eglon seems to have loved this kind of, banter. He loved it, right? He was into this. And again, we'll have to ask ourselves, was Ehud telling the truth? We'll see in a minute. So he said, be quiet. Basically, the king did not want Ehud to spill the beans in front of everybody, whatever he had to say. And we know everybody left the room. And the Ehud Ehud now came in properly into the room. Fantastic story. Now this guy Eglon, he was smart. He realized that in Israel it does get a little bit warm in the summer, and he made a kind of attic room, a room upstairs, presumably with marble and whatever, to be as cool as he possibly could be. And he was sitting up there. I've got a word from God. Wow. And look what he does. Eglon stood up. Says Rashi, and this will blow your mind. It blew my mind. 1 second. Is it Rashi or is it the Radak? Is it Rashi? Baliyat HaMakera? Yeah. Because he stood up for the one word of name of God, he had the merit to have Ruth as a descendant. The Gemara goes even more than that, and this is really mind-blowing. We know that when we are in shul, and the chazan, well, it depends, Ashkenazi shul, the Sephardim seem to sit down more than we do. There's a Kaddish going on or something, we stand up. There's Kedusha going on, we stand up. There's Baruch Hu going on, we stand up. The reason why we do this, it's quite extraordinary, the Gemara says, is because of this guy, Eglon. He stood up for the name of God. He set up the idea, when you hear the Shem Hashem, Elokim, you stand up. The greatest example I love, which is those who know the Yekis and grew up with the Yekis or lived in the Yeki community, when benching with a minyan, all of a sudden you had the word Elokeinu. So most people, they sort of, Elokeinu, they kind of try and raise themselves from the seat. If you're with the real Yekis, they stand up. Wow. There's a whole, it's like standing to attention, then they sit down again. The first time I saw that, I didn't know what was going on because I'd never seen it before. But it's Elokim. Why do you stand up for the name of God? Because Eglon did it. I mean, it's beyond belief. It really is quite extraordinary. But this is what we do. We're not worried about where the source comes from. If the truth comes from even a person like Eglon, we're prepared to take it. And this is a whole discussion. The Chamalevitz was criticized many years ago about this because she quotes a Reform rabbi all the time in her writings, a guy called Benno Jacob, who must have been a really smart guy. Why he was Reform, I don't know, because he certainly knew his Tanach, he knew his Bible for sure. I don't know about the history of the man, but the Chama quotes him the whole time. And she got a lot of flack for it because people were saying, how can you quote a Reform rabbi? And the answer was, there's a tradition. The Emet is where the truth comes from, that you recognize that. If you look at the beginning of the Hertz Chumash, the Sonsinu Chumash, that's what he said. He says that I've quoted here from non-Jewish sources and from all over the place, but I feel these are words of Emet, and I stay with that. That's my pitch, and that's why, unfortunately, the more right-wing religious world wanted to push that Chumash out of existence, and it's a great tragedy because there's fantastic stuff in there. There's an essay on evolution which is a must. You've got to read that essay. Unbelievable. This man wrote it nearly 100 years ago. Rabbi Hertz, but that's a story for another time. All right, so Eglon, unreal. He's standing up for the name of God. Listen to this. At that point, Kaf Aleph, this is where the 8th grade gets very exciting. Decided, Vayishlach Ehud et yad smolo. So Ehud did what he promised to do, his left hand. Vayikach et hacherev me'al yerech yamino, and he took out the sword, v'yitke'er bebidno, straight in the gut. Eglon did not stand a chance. And the description here, as I said, for 8th grade boys, it's the best. It tells you how the handle was sucked into the star. Oh, you're a British. I've just had my supper. I'm not feeling very good. And the fat covered up the blade. Oh, you're a British. He couldn't pull the sword out. It was lodged. Oy, but you'd say this is the worst. Par Shadona, and whatever you want to call it, the excellent. Basically, his kishkas came out. It was not very. It gives you glorious technicolor on the whole story. Wow. Now, Ehud was smart because he knows that he's in this room and they've locked the door because King said everybody out, and he knows that the king has this aliyah. He has this particular high place, and he's got a bathroom there, and he's very often, he's otherwise occupied for a long time. And Ehud realized that at this point he needs a quick getaway, because if he's sitting around locked in the room and he can't get out or whatever, he's going to be in trouble. So at this point, although everybody is out, it seems that the room was still accessible, but Ehud runs out and tells the guards, you see what happens? He says, lock it up. The king is in the bathroom and he needs his own private time. Pasuk Kaf Gimel Vayetze Ehud Amizderone came out into the porch or whatever. Vayizgor Datot Aliyah Badovana. He actually had the key and he did himself. He locked the room. And of course, the guard of honor sitting outside, they're waiting for the king to come out. And Ehud sort of makes a very quick exit and manages to get away from the guards. Unbelievable story. And the servants arrive. Everything's closed up. And, they don't want to go into Eglon because they know Eglon's got a bit of a temper. Oh, he's in the bathroom, leave him alone. They're going to leave him. And of course, they waited till it was a little bit embarrassing. In other words, they're sitting in the bathroom, but he's there for 2 hours already. No sign, there's nothing happening. We've talked about they had another key. They opened the door. No fail. Arzo met. The king is dead. Long died, in this case, long died the king. The Ehud Kavav, in the meantime, Ehud has made a disappearance into the Jewish world. The Ehud Nimlad Pasuk, it's a fantastic story. The Ehud Nimlad Ad Hitmamam, and while they were waiting for the Eglon to come out, Ehud managed to escape. V'hu avar tapsilim, he went past this quarry. The Yemolei Tasirot, he came to Seir, where the Jewish army or the camp was. And listen to this. It makes me cry when I read this, because again, I don't know. It's just so tragic when I think of these stories. 2006, I think it was. There was an officer, Roy Klein. I mean, it was a very well-known story. He was from boy who was head of a unit, and they were in Lebanon, and the enemy threw a hand grenade into the group, and he knew this was it. If he lets the great grenade go off, they're all going to be killed. So he threw himself, said Shema Yisrael, threw on the grenade, and he died. A man with 2 children, unbelievable. And and officers, this is what gets me now when the news comes out and you hear that it's a major. I think yesterday a major was killed, and these are very high up. These are leading the army from the front, not from the rear. And Pasuk Kavav, when Ehud comes back, now he can call the troops, because he's got the staff, he's got the metal, double TLE, I think that's how you spell it. And now he comes down from the mountain and he's leading the Jewish army. And this is fantastic. After me. I'm in front, I'm leading. And that has always been for the Jewish army of the ancient world, and certainly true for the Jewish army today. And it's challenging, because that's why, unfortunately, we lose these guys. The rank and file as well, but particularly the higher level officers. But they're there. They're with the troops. They're with everybody, and it's a tradition from Ehud. And it says, "Kinotar Hashem et oiveichem et Moab yedchem," and you're going to win. I promise you. Moab is history. And they went after him. The people followed him. And he's not the obvious leader because of his impediment and whatever. And they even stopped Moab running back. This is equivalent of running over the River Jordan back to what we would call Jordan today. That's Moab in the ancient world. They couldn't go back, and the enemy was stuck. Below not no Ishlavo, nobody could pass over the River Jordan to get back to Moab. And Vayaku et Moabitay, and they smote the Moabites. They wiped them out. Kaseret alafim ish, and they wiped out 10,000. And these numbers all of a sudden mean something to us because we're just hearing about the Gedudim. Sorry, and I'm just leaving you to make the comparisons here and to make the what you call in Yiddish the Zustells, putting things together, because it's just so current what we're learning, even though we're learning a story which is 3,000 years old. It's unreal. The undercurrents here are so topical. And 10,000 enemy. Kol Shamen, it just points out, by the way, they were also pretty rotund. So they weren't necessarily the fastest moving army, but they certainly presented a very, sort of solid flank of men. Nobody escaped. But on that day, took one day, and they were already defeated. Tachad Yad Yisrael, under the hand of Israel. 80 years. So you have to ask the question, if Othniel gave 40 years of peace, and Ehud gave 80 years of peace, but Othniel was the more seemingly spiritual man, then how do we understand Ehud giving 80 years of peace? How do we make head or tail of that? If it's in relation to the spirituality of the leader, which it seems to be, Othniel 40 years, Ehud 80 years, right? This is my favorite exam question. I gave this in college, right? Do you have any way to explain how Ehud could have been so much more significant in the history of the Jewish people that he secured 80 years of peace, whereas Othniel, who seems to have the credentials, Moshe Rabbeinu's whatever, relative, only secured 40 years? And it's a good question. And I got great essays from it, they try to be creative here. Sure.
So I'd like to comment on a few things, if you don't mind.
No, please.
First of all, you sort of seem to paint a picture that Ehud is a little bit of, not a nebuch, but, deformed in some way. But I teach this also, have a different picture of him. I think that just because he had one arm that wasn't usable, that he was much more like a Zorro, like a swashbuckling kind of guy who had the use of his left hand, and certainly went in, did the job. He was creative enough to say, I have a message from God. He knew exactly what to do, and he walked out like a spy, like anybody, an undercover agent. And it worked like a charm. And so I don't consider him a nebuch kind of guy.
All I can say is that my impression from the commentaries that I've read is that he used this kind of image that he may have had to get in the first place. How did he get through the door? If he was such a strong guy, they certainly would have not left him alone with the king. So that was my inclination, but I don't disagree with you. It could very well be you're right.
The natural examination for any of the guards would have been his left side instead of his right side.
Correct.
Because you would take the sword from your right to your,
and he would draw it from that side.
That way.
That's right.
And they didn't give that consideration.
Right.
So they made it. Okay, you don't have it over there. All right.
So there's nothing there.
There's nothing.
There was no there's nothing like an Azrieli, right? There was no machine to go through.
So that to me kind of says he was more than just.
Okay, I could accept that. I as I said, there's room for debate on what Ehud is.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is where you. I understand the Midrash connects root with Eglon.
Yeah.
But how could that be with the time difference?
Yeah.
Because I'll bet you talked about Ibzan as Boaz.
Well, that's the suggestion. But he's
100 and so almost 200 years later.
Correct.
So how are you going to rationalize?
That's why I can't. I use the word descendant because you can't be. He can't be the actual father of Ruth because it doesn't work out.
Or the
altered. Alta Zayda. I mean, there's some connection there because the rabbis wanted, I suppose, because of the Moabites. So that I guess they put it together, but I'd have to look at it again, the rabbinic source for that, and see if they give more. They might give a verse or something where the link is more than just semantic. It's a bit more than that. You see what I'm saying?
So when I'm reading the Midrashim and looking at the text, I find that it's a little difficult sometimes to find one word that you take a button and you sew a vest around it.
No, exactly. No, I agree. It's I mentioned it here just because it's just so, the whole thing of Ehud and what he represents is such a negative person, and yet so many positive things come from this. It's remarkable.
That's another thing.
And that's a rabbinic tradition.
He's a negative person. I think he's so dynamic.
Who, Eglon?
No, not Eglon.
Ehud's dynamic for sure.
It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
And just because he didn't marry into a religious family
Mrs. Ehud, we have no idea who she was.
Which is also,
no, I agree. I don't know.
Then why do we feel that if he was chosen to be a judge, there has to be some reason?
That
he had some kind of qualities that it was important for us to learn about.
Correct.
And it may not just been, there's a lot of yeshiva guys who can't sit and learn Gemara all day, but they have qualities about them that are very powerful. Right,
and need harnessing as in certain situations. I don't disagree. The reality is that, and again, this is rabbinic tradition. When they line the two guys up, Otniel on the scale of tradition is much more intense in terms of the rabbinic description of who he was and what he represented, etc., etc. Whereas Ehud, when the rabbis talk about Ehud and they line him up, not quite the same. He's one step down, at least, from Otniel in terms of their perception of what Ehud was. Right? Now, again, you're right. That's why I asked the question. 80 years suggests that he wasn't such a bad guy. The contrary, he doubles the time of peace from Otniel. Otniel did 40, he's done 80. Right. So you've got to allow for the fact that, as maybe not as strong as he was on certain things, he must have been very, very powerful in other ways. Uniting the Jewish people, leading Am Yisrael the way he did, it's incredible.
So my comparison, and I'll just stop, is that, Herzl wasn't such a religious guy, and he's a founder of the modern state of Israel.
Yeah, correct.
So, does God take people who don't have certain qualities because it makes him a more universal person, or is the appeal different, or whatever it is? Everyone doesn't have to be what we call a tzaddik to do good stuff.
Correct, and that's a good point, and that's always the question on leadership that we ask in every generation. That at the moment, the leadership that we have, for good, for better or for worse, that's what we've got. And sometimes it's God has a plan. That's all I believe. I really believe that. And it's just interesting that, again, we're not disagreeing. We're just seeing maybe from different perspectives. And I respect that because it's great.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we can all agree. Ehud was an amazing guy. There's no question about it. And I wish we knew who Mrs. Ehud was, because I'd love to know, but we don't.
Even know if there was a Mrs.
I hope there was.
Let's go back.
We're not told about her.
We also don't know how old Ehud was. The fact that he's able to get, quote, 80 years beyond him. Perhaps he's a much younger guy than Otniel, who was around already when you were for the whole 28 years of Israel.
And before.
So by the time he gets to leadership position, he's already older. So
correct.
The people remember him. By the time the new generation comes, whereas with Ehud, he's still alive, still influencing people for a much longer period. Maybe that's how he gets to 80.
Correct. And it's a valid point. And whichever way we look at it, the reality of Ehud is, and as I said, that's why I want to give him some airtime, because he is truly remarkable. Mm-hmm. Whichever way you look at it, he is true. And he unites the Jewish people in a way. He shows his own personal bravery. He's on a suicide mission because he's in a place where, he's likely to get killed. And he's uniting the Jews. He goes home, back to Am Yisrael, and he says, the king, the enemy, the head of the Nachash, as the expression we're hearing at the moment, has been killed. Now it's time we can defeat them. Wow, where does that idea come from? We hear it today, and Go back 3,000 years, and we've got the same story with Eglon. Unbelievable. All of the echoes. There's so many echoes over here. I want to talk a little bit. I want to show you this page that I printed up for you, because just a little bit about Ehud. There's some information there which I just want to share with you. I'm sorry, it's a little bit condensed and a little bit small, and also I had no time to produce a translation. I tried to summarize it at the bottom, but just listen to this, a little bit of background, because it's always good to have some idea. Again, this is from Rabbi Levi, who I mentioned before. He says like this: what do we know about the personality of Ehud? Min ha-pasuk on Roim, shahaya mishevi Binyamin. He was a Benjaminite. Okay, that's good. And he explains why that's significant. Muvan ma'od madua b'char Hashem Moshe b'shevi. Why all of a sudden the tribe of Benjamin? Right, and this is going to be a question we're going to ask again and again on the different Shoftim. Why that tribe specifically? And he says here, makes sense. Lo shed Yisrael miyad eglo melech Moab, to save the Jews. Why Benjamin? And he says, Shevet Zaya Nifga Be'ikrei Shibudah. They're the ones who bore the brunt of the Moabite servitude. Ki halo Yericho, interesting, but Nachlat Binyamin. Yericho is in Nachlat Binyamin, to me, is a street in Tel Aviv. But Nachlat Binyamin, in this sense, means literally the portion of Benjamin. So it turns out that Jericho, which we're told was afflicted by Moab, but Jericho belongs to Benjamin, and therefore the savior against Moab becomes a man of Benjamin. That I think is an interesting observation. Now, number two, he had this problem with his right arm. Normally, this would be something which the man of war would struggle with. He can't fight properly. Ehud Yodal and Natzel. That's why I find him so amazing. He knew that he could use what people might consider a disadvantage, letovato, for his advantage. And that's a powerful lesson. As I said, Kisharon, that's when you're finding the quality that a person has, and everybody has something to offer, something that they can better the world, tikkun olam, and that is something here which Ehud is inspirational, I would say. The next paragraph. He was certainly one of the leaders of the Jewish people. He was the messenger to take the gift to the king. So he was clearly, as you say in Yiddish, a bit of a macha. This is a comment from Rashi that he learned his tradition from Otniel. Otniel was the Rabbi a bit beforehand. Now, how do we know that Ehud was also a Talmudic or a biblical student, a student of Torah? And this is where it becomes so interesting about the sword. We daven every day and we use an expression, cherev pipiyot biyada. We say it every morning. The double-edged sword. What are we talking about? Why does the sword have to be double-edged? So, a simple interpretation is because that's more lethal, right? Double-edged sword. Both sides of the sword are sharpened, so you can't get him on one side, you get him on the other side. But it turns out that there is a rabbinic tradition here which is much stronger. In the Torah, Mount Sinai was known as Chorev, Mount Chorev. Interesting, not just Mount Sinai, Mount Chorev. And those are in, we mentioned Yekers before, if you're into Rabbi Hirsch, the fantastic book of Hirsch called Chorev. Explanation of the mitzvot, which is, you've got to read this book, it's amazing. So the word chorev is connected. Torah has the concept of a sword, compared to a sword. What's this all about? And again, this is a very strong rabbinic tradition, that learning Torah is like a war. Walk into Ponovich tomorrow morning, or walk into the Mir, over here, Brachva, wherever, the noise is deafening. When the guys are learning, they're all screaming at each other. Because the way you study Torah is not like in a library. Everyone sits, quiet and you can't even sort of say boo to a goose, as they say. In the yeshiva, if you're not screaming at your chavrusa, then you're not really learning properly. You got to shout at the guy shouts back at you. And then eventually everything quiets down because you agree or you disagree and you move on. And this is the allusion here to the sword of Ehud. Ehud, we thought, again, I presented him with less credentials. It turns out he has major credentials. His credentials are represented symbolically by the double-edged sword. double edge referring to the Torah Shebal Bichtav, the one edge symbolically referring to the written Torah that he was very well versed in, and the other edge referring to the Torah Shebal Peh. Now, this is not pshat. I'm not saying, so literal interpretation, but it's such a beautiful tradition of the rabbinic attitude to Ehud. And I'll show you this, comes from Midrash Tanchuma. Look at this indented paragraph. And I wanted to share this with you because it's so fantastic. It says, Vayaslo Ehud Cherev, he made a sword. V'lash de piyot, he had double edge. And we're told about this sword. Shehi ochelet b'shnei olamim. Symbolically, it eats in two worlds. What does that mean? Shayosek b'Torah, because Ehud was a man of Torah study as well, even though not obvious from the text, but he was. Shekatuv bok, and what does it say about the Torah? Cherev pipiyot biyadam, the sword, the double-edged sword, because the Torah has the element of the written Torah and the oral Torah. Shezocher b'olam hazeh, and from Torah you have merit in this world, u'olam haba, and in the world to come. Unbelievable. I'm just going to read the next paragraph. Ehud ra'a shelo yuchal lemalei shlichuto b'yitziah lemilchama mibli la'ametz mikodem et libam shel Yisrael. And he knew, I've got to galvanize the Jews. This is the problem at the moment. After months and months of disruption here, right? Overnight, we had to put our trust in leadership, which we were, not all of us, but many of us were having questions about because of what was going on before. And this is always the problem. How do you galvanize the Jewish people to follow you? And this is what Ehud understood. So what did he do? The best thing he can do is go and kill the enemy king. He goes in, he puts himself into ultimate danger. He comes out, he goes back, and he's obviously got proof that I don't know how he proved it, because normally he used to bring the head, right? That's how with Goliath, you took his head and you proved that he was dead. Guy without a head is probably dead. So, but with obviously they believed Ehud that this is what he did, and Hamatil Eimatal Yisrael, and then he would put the fear of God literally into the Jewish people. And of course, the men of Moab would be petrified. Here's this guy that we thought he was maybe not who he really is, and look what he's done to us. He's killed our king. And then because the whole thing is so quick and sudden, he can take the people to war. And he talks about tefillah over here, and he gives a whole description of it. It's really, really something. I brought over here in section B the Ma'am Loez. Ma'am Loez is this very wonderful comment. It's available in English on the whole of Tanach. And the Ma'am Loez develops, and I don't want to go into it now, the whole connection with Ruth, which, again, I'll leave you to look at that. But what I suggest is that if you can get hold of the English version, if you have it, or get hold of it, it may even be online, I don't know. And there you'll see in this reference here, he talks about the connection, section B, between the story of Ehud over here and the story of Ruth, which will come about at a later time. But as a result of the defeat of Moab, all of a sudden, that the Moabites have gone back home, and then unfortunately things go bad again, and the leadership runs away from Israel eventually, Elimelech, and he goes off to Moab. So I brought that in because I thought historically that's an interesting development that goes on. Rabbi Rabinovitz in section C, again, he also very much on those lines. I want to sort of leave it at that. I want to just say one final thing, because this is the challenge today, which we have, and I didn't give out the page, but I want to raise it, because one of the other issues is when he says, I have a message from God. He goes to the king, and the king stands up. So the king obviously thought that he's going to give him a bracha, he's going to bless him. I never forget, I was Sunday for one of the grandchildren in Florida, and all of a sudden there's a line of people after the bris waiting to get a bracha. I said, well, who are they waiting for? I was looking for the Rebbe. Turns out I was the Rebbe for the day, because I was the Sunday, and they all wanted a bracha from me. So I thought, no, this is not what I do. They would insist it's a Sephardic tradition, not certainly no Ashkenazim in the line. And it turns out, that obviously Ehud, by bringing this message or whatever, saying he's got a secret message from God, it's a blessing. It's and Eglon seemed to have been clued into that. So, of course, the question is, can we accuse Ehud of subterfuge? He said, I've got a secret from God, but his secret the rabbis explain, is the secret is I've got a secret sword, which I'm going to use to kill you, right? And at this point, Eglon thinks that the secret is he's got a message from God that he's going to bless him. So can we play like that? And it's interesting. There's another commentary which I'll refer back to in future shiurim from Rav Ariel, who's a contemporary, still teaches in the north of Israel, and he says that the book of Judges has this theme again and again. Think about Yael and the way she tricked Sisera. She tricked him. Come in, Bubala, not Bubala, he's a very mighty warrior. And she gives him something to drink, and the poor guy is exhausted. Next thing you know, he's got a permanent headache, which he can never shake off. That's what happened to him. And Shimshon, look at the way Shimshon plays with the Pelishtim. He's there and he's not there, and of course he's a one-man army, so eventually he hits them, but it's not on behalf of the Jewish people. He wants to take the heat away from Am Yisrael. Unbelievable. So this is a question which is raised on the story of Ehud. What's the message of Ehud when we negotiate with an enemy who doesn't play fair? And it gave me the shivers when I read this, because look what we're doing at the moment. We're negotiating with an enemy who is not bound by the rules of fairness. I mean, put it bluntly, my God, that's a nice way of putting it. These guys do not play by the book. And are we being held to a higher standard, which we should turn around and say, you know what, maybe we can finagle a little bit, we can not play by the book? I don't know. Because what we're seeing here is that Ehud sent a message for longevity to say, you know what, you go to the enemy, and if you can get in by subterfuge, get in there and kill the guy. And Yael shows the same thing with Sisera, Shimshon. I mean, there's many examples as you go through biblical stories. Do we have to be 100% honest in our dealings with an enemy who's not honest with us? I'm just raising the issue because it's such an interesting and what a topical item that we have to deal with. And I just can't imagine how people in the government sleep at night, with the Chatufim still where they are and everything that's going on. And let's pray, let's hope that they do the right thing. These deals are made and whatever has to be done is done. But the story of Ehud certainly gives us food for thought, no question in my mind. The character of Ehud, the question of disability, which I think is really significant, right? And that can be a whole evening discussion on its own about what we learn from Ehud and the principle of what he represents. The fact that, he doesn't come over as a learned figure, but the Gerah, the sword, has this representation symbolically of what it represents. And then finally, the way that you deal with war with an enemy, you want them to be fair, but we know that they're not. And I remember I gave this shiur 20 years ago. And what was I talking about then? Negotiation after the Lebanon war with whoever was captured at the time. I think it was Shalit. I think that was when Gilad Shalit was, and they were starting the negotiations. And this has been an ongoing thing. And I mentioned it then, and now, of course, we're talking Nebuch about the same thing again. I don't know. I just hope and pray to God that, we do the right. Don't worry about what the BBC wants us to do, but let's do what Hashem wants us to do. And I hope, please God, we will get it right. For next time, I'm going to give you a bit of homework. Start reading about Devar. Basic question. Is a female judge, let alone today. I love this woman. There's a woman in Brooklyn called Ruchi Froya, what's her name? Hasidic woman who's now a judge on the circuit in Brooklyn. An amazing woman. Hasidic, the real deal. 10 children at home, make Shabbos, the whole work. She talks about it in court. And it's phenomenal. So today I can live with that. But in the biblical world, to have a Devorah who is so out of the box and so amazingly, sort of put together in so many ways, it's going to challenge us. And Mitzvah Shem, I look forward to sharing some ideas about Devorah with you. 2 weeks' time, please God. We look forward. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.